Ariel saw now that they were in a short, broad corridor, whose walls halfway up were arrased, and on those tapestries were many stories pictured, whereof he knew not at that time the purport. Above the tapestries it seemed there were paintings, but he could not see for gloom, for the candle-bearers were behind, and before him the only light came from an open door, through which poured a red glow, as of a big fire. "That," said Vire, "is the tail fire, blazing in the room of logs. There does it burn all through the year, for 'tis a magic fire, and greatly aids the teller in his tale. But thither we now go." And Ariel said that seemed better to him than aught else. Then all that company came laughing and talking into the room whence came the red glow. A fair room it was, as might be felt even by the fire flicker which danced upon the walls and low ceiling, while deep shadows lay in the nooks and corners. Round the great hearth was a multitude of soft rugs, yielding cushions strewn, and a little to one side was a deep chair with carven arms and feet. And so it was that Ariel felt at that time, and at all others whereon he entered there at the hour of tale-telling, that whatso the number of the folk and children the room felt ever just great enough, but not large, small enough, but not overthronged. Then all sat them down where they would, old and young, but Lindo in the deep chair, and Vire upon a cushion at his feet, and Ariel, rejoicing in the red blaze for all that it was summer, stretched nigh the hearthstone. Then said Lindo, "Of what shall the tales be tonight? Shall they be of the great lands and of the dwellings of men, of the Valar and Valinor, of the West and its mysteries, of the East and its glory, of the South and its untrodden wilds, of the North and its power and strength, or of this island and its folk, or of the old days of Kor, where our folk once dwelt? For that this night we entertain a guest, a man of great and excellent travel, a son, meseems, of Arendel. Shall it be of voyaging, of beating about in a boat, of winds and the sea?" But to this questioning some answered one thing and some another, till Ariel said, "I pray you, if it be to the mind of the others, for this time tell me of this island, and of all this island most eagerly would I learn of this goodly house, and this fair company of maids and boys. For of all houses this seems to me the most lovely, and of all gatherings the sweetest I have gazed upon." Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. Are we ready for some stories? I promised you last time that we would enter into the tales, and now here we are in the tales to test the theorizing that we've been doing through all of the previous conversations that I've had with you. And I must admit I'm a little nervous, which is interesting. I've been talking and talking and talking about the tales, about finding the tales, about crafting the tales, about style and mythology and what Tolkien thought he was up to, and now suddenly I am tongue-tied and terrified at the thought of not being able to tell the tale with the appropriate magic. Well, what did you think of that passage that I just read, which was a bit of a tongue twister, I must say? Would you have guessed that was the author of The Lord of the Rings, with this impossible kind of tonguey twisty? I mean, Arast, what kind of word is that? We might as well be talking about Icor, and we've got tapestries and gloom and candle bearers and this tail fire blazing in the room of logs. There's clearly, possibly, hints here of the fire, the hall where Frodo hears stories in Rivendell, where he finds Bilbo dreaming over the fire and remembering the stories that he's learned while living at Rivendell with Elrond. But we have here characters speaking whom we've probably never heard of. This Ariel, who apparently is a son of Arendel, but a man, not an elf of any sort, and Vire, and and absolutely every kindergarten story room you've ever encountered. Yes, it's this. If you could imagine your favorite sort of children's story time, wouldn't it look exactly like this room that we've just had described? We've got rugs and cushions. We've got a big deep chair. a cushion that Vire, this character, can lean upon, and it's all filled with. I mean, it's the antithesis, I suppose, of Alice in Wonderland. Neither too big nor too small. It's kind of a Goldilocks room, right? The folk and children in the room felt ever just great enough, but not large; small enough, but not overthronged. And well, what kind of stories are we going to get here? If you are well read in your Tolkien lore, and if you can read the cover of my book, right? This is from the Book of Lost Tales, and it's in fact the oldest version that we have of Tolkien's own efforts at storytelling. We have, thanks to Christopher and his lovely edition and descriptions of it, a fair amount of evidence about exactly when Tolkien wrote this version of what in the long run will in fact become the Silmarillion. So this is deep backstory, right? But we know from the notebooks that Tolkien was drafting these stories into, that this version of the story comes from the period immediately after he comes back from the trenches, right? He's recovering in hospital. These are probably written down when he's at Great Haywood in hospital, and the Edith is there with him, copying down the stories for him and being his sort of note taker. The chapter that I'm reading to you from is called The Cottage of Lost Play, but the whole volume is, in fact, it's 2 volumes, and you can see I'm playing with different editions, right? This is the trade paperback larger version of the stories. This is these are 2 volumes, volume 1 and volume 2 of what is called the Book of Lost Tales. So we're in the Cottage of Lost Play, setting up to learn the stories that were lost. Sorry, I was saying that these are written down. We know that the Cottage of Lost Play that I just read is written down probably in February 1917. There's a note in one of the notebooks in Edith's hand that it's transcribed out on or her initials, right? On February 12th, 1917, which I, seen as I'm always going to be trying to do this exercise here, my birthday, February 12th, not 1917, and therefore we can date fairly accurately, at least when some of these drafts were made. The collection as a whole seems to have been finished around, in the form that Christopher found it in these notes, around June 1919, by which time Tolkien was already involved in working at the Oxford English Dictionary, and so he's out of college and in his first professional job around age 23, 24, 25, right? So fairly young. The collection includes, if you're familiar with the Silmarillion, it will include stories that you should have some familiarity with. The Music of the Aenir, The Coming of the Valar and the Building of Valinor, The Chain of Melko. You do know him, but under a different name. The Coming of Elves, The Making of Kor, The Theft of Melko and the Darkening of Valinor, giving you a clue. The Flight of the Noldoli, The Tale of the Sun and Moon, The Hiding of Valinor, Gilfanon's Tale, The Travail of the Noldoli, and The Coming of Mankind. That's volume 1. Volume 2, we carry on with The Tale of Tunuviel, Turambar and the Foaloka, The Fall of Gondolin, The Nauglefring, The Tale of Arendelle, The History of Ariel or Alfwine, and The End of the Tales. In other words, roughly speaking, the sketch of the stories of the Silmarillion. But you've probably never heard of the Cottage of Lost Play, and you don't understand what I just read, because, interestingly, and this is, Christopher explains this in his edition here, when he went to edit the later version of all of these stories, and what you're going to learn in the course of these discussions is the Silmarillion went through a lot of revising, and we don't have quite the same. If you thought the Silmarillion was hard to read, the Book of Lost Tales is even harder, because you have constructions like "Whence came the red glow" and "Fire flicker which danced upon." It's like all of this very archaizing and well, unfortunately, a little bit twee language play in these early versions of the stories. When Christopher went to edit the later versions of these stories, he didn't find that the later versions maintained this particular tale-telling construction, and so the Silmarillion, very confusingly, simply starts out of nowhere, right? Now that is it was an interesting choice on Christopher's part, and he's saying that when he was making his choices about how to edit the Silmarillion, and saying that the Silmarillion, this is Christopher talking to him, his own, the readers of the Book of Lost Tales, is saying the Silmarillion is commonly said to be a difficult book. It is, needing explanation and guidance on how to approach it. And in this it is contrast to the Lord of the Rings. In chapter 7 of his book, The Road to Middle-earth, Professor T.A. Shippey accepts that this is so, saying the Silmarillion could never be anything but hard to read, and expounds his view of why it should be, and so forth. The Silmarillion is published in 1977, and Christopher starts coming out with what this is in effect the first volume of what becomes the 12 volumes of the History of Middle-earth, and this one is first published in 1983. So we've had a few years in sort of real life time, in our sort of ordinary historical time, of having the Silmarillion out there and people struggling to read it, and then Christopher says, well, oops. Right? And he does actually say that at one point. He says, giving a publication history of how his father worked on the Silmarillion over some decades, and when Christopher decided to publish a version of it in 1977, he says it's certainly debatable whether it was wise to publish in 1977 a version of the primary legendarium standing on its own and claiming, as it were, to be self-explanatory. The published work has no framework, no suggestion of what it is, and how within the imagined world it came to be. This I now think to have been an error. And Christopher going, whoops. Right? It's like, if you think of the Silmarillion as hard, it's like, where's my copy of the Silmarillion? The Silmarillion just opens with nothing, right? It's like, bang, here we are. There was Eru, the one who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and you think, what am I doing? Why am I suddenly in this story? Who's the story? And when the Silmarillion came out, it was, I've said to you all, when I first read it and read it in this paperback copy, I didn't know what to make of it, because it's so different from the Lord of the Rings. It has none of the flavor of the adventure that you get when you have hobbits in the story, and this very distanced version. Well, that is, and we've been talking about this is one of these great difficulties for fairy stories, is how do you in fact get inside the story? Constantly, that's our question. It's like it was our question with the very first of these videos. It was our question last time when I was talking about on fairy stories and what it is. And here we have, in fact, Tolkien's first effort at a fairy story. Well, if you thought that part that I just read was a bit difficult, what do you think about the beginning? Now it happened, on a certain time, that a traveler from far countries, a man of great curiosity, was by desire of strange lands and the ways and dwellings of unaccustomed folk, brought in a ship as far west even as the lonely island, Tol Eressëa in the fairy speech, but which the gnomes call Dor Fadwin, the land of release, and a great tale hangs there too. Well, that's at least a little better, right? We're starting with a setup of, okay, now, and I hadn't noticed this before, but the next 6 paragraphs all start with now. It's like over and over again. Now it happened. Now one day. Now as he stood, now these rocks, now Ariel, we've got Ariel, our traveler, right? Now was he at the summit. That this insistence of time is very interesting. Now it's like there's a kind of incantation in the exercise of wanting to say, well, it's a little liturgical, right? And if you're familiar, I was suggesting last time that the time, it's like, what is it that Tolkien wants to achieve with all of his storytelling? It's that, well, we're reminding you of the things that he says fairy stories do. One, fantasy, which is a kind of exercise of the imagination, so just leave that aside. But the role of fairy stories is to provide escape, but that escape is in fact into adventure, right? You're escaping from the world in which signs just say coffee room, or to do another Chestertonian, it's like when electric lights are all inevitable, right? We're escaping, but into that secondary reality, which I was suggesting last time has this kind of liturgical feel, and that some veil is pulled back, and you are in another reality that the storytelling itself enables, right? That enchantment somehow, right? So we escape into the story, we recover I think the best phrase for it, we recover a sense of wonder, awe, joy at being able to see the world fresh, right? But interestingly, it's still our world. It's like there's that tension between saying, well, fairy is this other realm, but on the other hand, it's Middle Earth. It's in fact our habitation. It's where we are. So you escape by finding yourself in a story. You recover your sense of wonder at, in fact, being in a story already. And you have the experience of consolation, that eucatastrophe, that moment of grace. And I do apologize to those of you who are not watching Owen. I've been studying a lot of Owen because I find like we're suddenly traveling on intersecting tracks with worrying about what story is. And I think if you watch his stuff, you're going to start seeing that this like we're trying to figure out this same sort of experience of which story do you find yourself in at this particular moment. I don't want to have to make you watch all of the streams, but maybe you do have to watch all the streams. We're living in, which song are we living in, is the way that he's been showing his audience. What kind of tale do you think you're in? Well, you can be in one of two simultaneously, because, and this is the way I would put it, but the way Tolkien's putting it is there's our primary reality and our secondary reality. What Owen was showing in the episode that I just watched is, which song are you in? Are you in everybody knows that the world is fallen and corrupt, and the Leonard Cohen song, you have to cross your fingers whenever you throw the dice, right? It's like everything's lies and luck. Or are you in Amazing Grace, the story that is that heavenly story? I think ultimately that's what we're really struggling with here. It's how do you understand yourself to be in the story of the city of God as opposed to the story of the city of the world, and therefore that's a very Augustinian kind of claim. I'm really now worried that I've done too many things all at one time, but I let me just drop that in as the problem that we're wrestling with when you're saying Tolkien wanted fairy stories to be now in this world, in our primary reality, but also in fairy, and that tension is constantly what he's trying to describe. And the best way that I can say that I've had that feeling of what I think he's trying to describe is those tears of joy when you find yourself recognizing that you're in grace. Okay, hold on to that though. And thinking about, we're testing what it means to be in in the story, in fairy stories, and how do you get there, and what does it take, in fact, to have that experience of finding yourself in the story? Well, this is what Tolkien is trying to figure out in this early version of the Silmarillion, and this very opening scene of the Cottage of Lost play. And the first thing he does is say now. And I got off on that long riff just then because there's a liturgical element to that, in that the chant for a feast day is always today, hodie. It's like if you're doing it in Latin, it's like hodie, today, say the Feast of the Virgin Mary's Assumption, which is the one that I tend to know the chants for well. Today the Virgin is, exalted above the choirs of angels to the heavenly throne, right? But or today is the day on which such and such a saint entered into heaven, and so we're celebrating his feast day. Today is the now is, we are now, it happened on a certain time. I mean, that's kind of like once upon a time, but Tolkien wants it to be now, in this moment. We need to be now on a certain time. And the traveler from far countries, okay, so we are pilgrims. I mean, there's a pilgrim story here, that you are, and this again is a Christian understanding, that we are wayfarers in this life, heading towards our true home, our heavenly home, but that within this life we expect our present life to be a model or glimpse of, in fact, that life that we are going to find ourselves in. So we're a traveler here from far countries, a man of great curiosity. So he's longing for knowledge, longing for learning, traveling, was by desire of strange lands and the ways and dwellings of unaccustomed folk, brought in a ship as far west even as the lonely island. Tol Eressëa in the fairy speech, but which the gnomes, you don't really use to think of gnomes, do you? Well, gnomes in Tolkien, like garden gnomes, that seems so like twee again. Called Dol Fedwin, the land of release, right? It's like, if you remember what Tolkien was saying, he thought fairy stories were doing, which was escape, recovery, and consolation, so that we're somehow come to that place where you get, I don't want to say satisfaction because that's not quite it. Consolation is not exactly satisfaction. Consolation is that feeling of eucatastrophe, that moment of recognizing yourself within the story and turning from sorrow to joy, so that touch of grace, right? By this traveler is there on the lonely island. Now what's interesting about this, if you read carefully, and Christopher walks you through some of this in his introduction, if you read carefully, you realize that the way Tolkien is plotting out all of the things in this story, this lonely island, it's in the far west, the Ariel, we find out, is the traveler's name, brought to this lonely island, but it's in fact, in certain very interesting ways, actually England. when we know that what Tolkien wanted to do was write a mythology for England, this island that his character comes to, which is called Tol Eressëa in the fairy speech, is in the west, is in fact England. Somehow, not quite. He's doing this very interesting, as usual, right? The now and the here is where we actually already are, our true habitation, and the characters come for the stories. And so he's walking around and he's finding different towns, a hill. He comes up to a hill, and here we find a little house. Now this again, this is a little strange for the majesty that the elves get eventually, but in this story they're still called gnomes, and we find in the footnote that he did mean that to be a lofty term, right? That Tolkien says in a draft for the Lord of the Rings he wrote, I've sometimes, not in this book, used gnomes for Noldor and gnomish for Noldorin, thinking that he could talk about gnomes and have it suggest knowledge. But of course, what you tend to think of with gnomes is little statues in a garden, right? But it's not clear that that isn't what he's imagining, because our traveler, who's somewhere on this island, he's come on ship to this isle in the west. We're not really clear where it is in the story, but you're imagining yourself into this island, and he finds himself. He finds this little house, tiny dwelling, whose many small windows were curtained snugly, yet only so that a most warm and delicious light, as of heart's content within, looked forth. Then his heart yearned for kind company, and the desire for wayfaring died in him, and impelled by a great longing, he turned aside at this cottage door. This is the cottage of lost play, right? It's very much a children's story still, but not really. And knocking, asked one who came, and opened what might be the name of this house and who dwelt therein. And it was said to him that this was Mar Vanwa Tia Lieva, or the cottage of lost play, and at that name he wondered greatly. There dwelt within, 'twas said, Lindo and Vire, who had built it many years ago, and with them were no few of their folk and friends and children. And at this he wondered more than before, seeing the size of the cottage. But he that opened to him, perceiving his mind, said, Small is the dwelling, but smaller still are they that dwell here. For all who enter must be very small indeed, or of their own good wish to become as very little folk, even as they stand upon the threshold. So you're almost promised that it's going to be this grand adventure, right? The traveler coming from afar, a man of great curiosity on the ship, and then you find out that you're basically going to go into a magic house where you shrink. Some of this old understanding of the elves persisted, obviously, into the writing of The Hobbit 20 years later. This is a story written around 1917, 1919, right? And 20 years later, when we have The Hobbit, Rivendell still has some of this sort of little fairy characteristic, right? That the elves are sort of, childlike and sing along, ding along kind of characters. But it's still already in tension for Tolkien, because it's the passage that I read to you already. We have some grandeur attempted here with the arrast tapestry covered walls and the great the inverted language and all of that, so that we want some of the sort of archaizing majesty. But on the other hand, we also still have a magic house that when you go into, he says, when he sees this little house, is told, but to enter into this house you have to become little. So in what sense it's not exactly clear. He goes across the threshold of the house and finds out, oh my gosh, it's really big, right? So in that sense, Tolkien is still playing with the older tropes of you find yourself in a fairy house and the fairy house is bigger on the inside. Again, not really what we tend to imagine Rivendell as, but it's early in Tolkien's wrestling with the problem of what it is to find yourself. How do you make that passage into the story, into the storytelling? Do you have to become small? Do you have to become childlike? What I suppose, what attitude do you have to have in order to enter into this tale? Well, he comes in and he finds the house full of children and mirth and much laughter and storytelling. They have a feast and some conversation about exactly where they are. That he's now, Lindo tells him he's passed into the land of elms and the place of flowers. We are, in a great circle of trees and so forth. There's a lot of this this kind of grand highfalutin language. Well, by this point, you're probably wondering when this, if you're used to the Silmarillion being hard, and you're used to the Lord of the Rings being at least, well, we've talked about whether or not the critics enjoy it as a children's story. What did the critics think of the Book of Lost Tales when it first came out? Well, it, you know, not much. And what is interesting is I'm going with the Tolkien Companion and Guide, which, you know, is our good go-to for standard of scholarship. Most early reviewers of the Book of Lost Tales suggested, so it was Thomas Egan in the New York Tribune, say, for example, the prose style is a quasi-biblical archaic form of English, which may scare off some readers. It is not as polished as the later Silmarillion turned out to be, but it is livelier in action scenes, and at times the prose and the inserted poem epics is majestic enough to give us a feel of a lost elder world that has much to teach man, even modern man, about the search for honor and glory and self-worth. Contrast with, for example, John Baxter, writing in The Australian, this is mostly dull stuff. The academic jottings of a nascent medievalist toying with fantasy worlds. You won't find the matter-of-fact hobbits here, the evil or the tragedy of the Ring books. The prose is choked with whimsy, and the occasional verses read like Tennyson's first draft. It does Tolkien no service to exhume this rightly forgotten juvenilia. Okay, so on the one hand, we might be delighted that it's archaic, and this reviewer, Egan, also suggests it will disturb, even shock many of the faithful in its rawer themes and pagan associations of ancient folklore. We knew that Tolkien was always wanting to attempt that, but we get it in less polished form in this early version. But it retains its power to fascinate and inspire feelings of wonder in our imaginations. Well, inspire feelings of wonder or rightly forgotten juvenilia. Our usual tension in understanding whether or not you like fairy stories, but my guess is I suspect even some of you who love The Lord of the Rings still find it a little hard to get into it. Do we really want to have, or do we, cozy fireside tale telling with lots of cushions and a deep chair? It feels like, well, this is what I wanted to get to in thinking about this. It's like, what kind of storytelling actually accomplishes the magic, and testing our high theorizing against Tolkien's early attempts. I thought, well, okay, so thinking about that, are you disappointed that Tolkien's early efforts, he's only 24, 25, maybe some of you are at that age, or maybe you have some juvenilia that you wrote back when you were that age, and you're saying, are we disappointed that he had to start from such a kind of predictably Tennysonian, sort of faux William Morris place, or do we wish he had stuck with that over the long run? What works and what doesn't? And again, it's like my forging exercise here is always to be, I hope, helping you appreciate the art of what Tolkien did accomplish, and seeing how even he in his early drafts may or may not have accomplished it as well as we would hope for him to, and therefore consider what is it that we need in order to feel ourselves inside the story. Well, Tolkien, he was nervous about it, and Christopher in his introduction points to a number of places where his father was also sort of anxious about what kind of editing it would take to bring the Silmarillion into publication, and he told one reader of The Lord of the Rings in 1963 that he wasn't sure it was ever gonna come to pass, because he says, I'm doubtful myself about the undertaking, like editing the rest of his story world, his legendarium. Quote, part of the attraction of The Lord of the Rings is, I think, due to the glimpses of a large history in the background. An attraction like that of viewing far off an unvisited island, or seeing the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist. To go there is to destroy the magic, unless new unattainable vistas are again revealed. To go there is to destroy the magic. And look at these two things that he mentioned. An attraction like that of viewing far off an unvisited island. See that his first impulse in trying to craft this kind of storytelling was to create islands, and these storytelling islands. And there's famously, this is the earliest map that he drew, which it's not quite where we are in the story now, but he's already sort of with this sea longing, given his character, that Ariel comes to this island where this little cottage is, where he goes in and finds, the hall of tales, the tale fire blazing in the room of logs. Sorry, and I want that. It's like the I called this episode round the tale fire. That you need a fire, you need the hall of logs, you need that storytelling setting, the mead hall, Rivendell. That's where they tell stories. It's around this fire, but on the island, right? And he's given us this character who travels and finds an island, and that's where you find the story. And when he's writing this to Colonel Worsket in 1963, saying, the glimpses of the larger history, like viewing far off an unvisited island. That always seems to be where Tolkien is longing. The story lives somewhere on that island that you need to sail to, and you'll recognize that motif from The Lord of the Rings, that they sail off to Valinor, right? And that becomes the Blessed Isle somewhere. They're always sailing west into the archipelagos and finding stories out there in the islands, or seeing the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist. And this is where this all gets very interesting, because saying that he once told Erisea, the lonely island, to be in the fairy speech. You'd think that it should be Valinor, right? That Ariel has ended up in, but it's not. It's this Tol Eressëa, which is somehow, I was suggesting England. Well, how do we know that? It's because when Lindo explains where they are, he's in a city called Cotirion, and this city is the one where you now find yourself. Well, what's Cotirion? We have an even earlier verse, probably written in where do I have my November 1915, so a few years before he starts writing the prose version, trying to write a just poetic version of that city that he glimpsed, that he says is glimpsed, gleaming in a sunlit mist. And that Ariel is told that this cottage that he's now in, hearing the stories around the fire, is in this city called Cotirion. Well, where's Cotirion? Cotirion among the trees. O fading town upon a little hill, old memory is waning in thine ancient gates, the road gone grey, thine old heart almost still. The castle only frowning ever waits, and ponders how among the towering elms the gliding water leaves these inland realms, and slips between long meadows to the western sea, still bearing downward over murmurous falls, 1 year and then another to the sea, and slowly thither have many gone, since first the fairies built Cotirion. Coterion. O spiry town upon a windy hill, with sudden winding alleys, shady walled, where even now the peacocks pace a stately drill, majestic sapphire and emerald. Behold thy girdle of a wide champaign, sunlit and watered with a silver rain, and richly wooded with 1,000 whispering trees that cast long shadows in many a bygone noon, and murmured many centuries in the breeze. Thou art the city of the land of elms, Alalminore in the fairy realms. It goes on. You see why our Australian reviewer said maybe leave it aside. I mean, it's like it's the impulse that everyone has when you first start writing fairy verses, right? We have peacocks that are emerald peacocks, sapphire, majestic, and sapphire. Why it doesn't work is an interesting question, because it's not impossible to write this kind of lofty verse, but it's very, very difficult for it not to come across as overwrought, right? Sing of thy trees, old Coterion, thine oaks and maples with their tassels on, thy singing poplars and the splendid yews that crown thine aged walls, and muse of somber grandeur all the day, until the twinkle of the early stars is tangled palely in their sable bars, until the 7 lampets of the silver bear swing slowly in their shrouded hair, and diadem the fallen day, O tower and citadel of the world, when bannered summer is unfurled. Most full of music are thine elms, and gathered sound that overwhelms the voices of all other trees. Sing then of elms, beloved Coterion, how summer crowds their full sails on, like clothed mast of verdurous ships, a fleet of galleons that proudly slips across long sunlit seas. It goes on to several more sets of verses. To the last verse, I need not know the desert or red palaces where dwells the sun, the great seas or the magic isles, the pine woods piled on mountain terraces, and calling faintly down the windy miles, touches my heart no distant bell that rings in populous cities of the earthly kings. Here do I find a haunting ever near content, said midmost of the land of withered elms, Alalminore of the fairy realms. Here circling slowly in a sweet lament, linger the holy fairies and immortal elves, singing a song of faded longing to themselves. It's not profound. I keep wanting it to be. I enjoy reading it because I want it. I want to be one of those children on the cushions around the fire listening to something that's enchanting, and it's trying too hard, right? It's clearly trying too hard, and yet the longing is so powerful there. Why doesn't it work? What is it that he's doing wrong? Well, some of what's interesting is Coterion, by a variety of clues, is in fact identifiable as Warwick, the city in England, and Alalminore is Warwickshire. He also has a place name in the story, Tavrobel, which seems to be Great Hayward, where he is at the time that he's writing down these stories with Edith. And if you know your Tolkien legendarium well enough, you know that the story of Tinuviel is the story of Beren and Luthien, and Edith is his Luthien, and the famous scene where she dances in a wood, rather like the one that he's trying to describe here, comes from this period, right? He's a young man in love, and he is trying to describe that sense of longing for a distant past, but he's actually in the moment that he is most wanting to live. I mean, there's that now, and yet there's that desire for distance. I mean, I hadn't thought of this before I just said it. Desire for children. Edith is going to get pregnant while he's writing these stories, and they will have their first child. It's... I don't know. Do you write your worst stories when you're actually most wanting simply to have the children? He's wanting to write stories for himself as a child, I think, because they're fairly young, 20, 23, 24, 25. Edith's a little older. but he's also not able to, what he's able to think about when he's older, capture that feeling of that glimpse, right? The glimpse of the far off unvisited island, or seeing the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist. 1963, he recognizes that it's hard to capture that feeling, even though that is the story feeling that he's been working for all of his life. Well, Christopher points to a letter that Tolkien also wrote, that Tolkien wrote to him, to Christopher, while Christopher, this was in 1945, and Christopher's away in war, and Tolkien is describing to him what it's been like writing The Lord of the Rings, and says, it's hard, right? Because he's trying to tell the story. He's trying to give sort of substance to this great legendarium that he's been working within for so many years, and yet he still doesn't want to do it quite, right? He says a story must be told, or there'll be no story. Yet it is the untold stories that are most moving. I think you are moved, Christopher, he says, by Celebrimbor because it conveys a sudden sense of endless untold stories. Mountains seen far away, never to be climbed. Distant trees, like niggles, never to be approached, or if so, only to become near trees, unless in paradise or inns perish. So we have these two sort of longings that Tolkien has later in life. One, it's like glimpses of that large history in the background and untold stories. And both of those things, you'd think it would be satisfying to read what Tolkien went through to create that sort of huge tapestry. And it's interesting that tapestry comes in here, right? It's like the passage that we started with right now in our storytelling, that Ariel is walking down this corridor and it's hung with tapestries with stories on them. And you look at a tapestry and you see the figures depicted in it and you don't know what the story is, and there's that longing to know what the story is. But are you more or less satisfied when you find out what the story was, right? It's like we Tolkien's playing with this, the kind of the name magic already. When Lindo says to Ariel, they're talking about where he is, and let me read this paragraph. This is the first full introduction that we get to wherever this story is, and Tolkien's already trying to create this sense of glimpses and stories that are yet untold, and then make you long for them to be told. Where do they come from? So Ariel, as they ate, so Ariel's gone into the little cottage and they're eating, and he tells them of his adventures, and then he asks where he is. Lindo said to him, "Know then that today, or more like 'twas yesterday, you crossed the borders of that region that is called Alal Minore, or the land of elms, which the gnomes call Garlosian, or the place of flowers." And we saw that Tolkien had already written these verses on the land of elms, the Criterion, right? And that he's using actually where Edith had been living while she's waiting for him in Warwickshire, and then where they're living. He's using the actual locations where they are to project this sense of distance and glimpses and untold stories, but it's actually where we are. The now and the distant is beautifully constantly in tension here. Now this region is accounted the center of the island and its fairest realm. But above all the towns and villages of Alal Minore is held Koromas, or as some call it, Coterion, and this city is the one wherein you now find yourself. Both because it stands at the heart of the island, and from the height of its mighty tower do those that speak of it with love call it the citadel of the island, or of the world itself. So you've traveled and you think you're, at this far edge of the west, and you find out you're actually at the center of everything. It's an interesting magic that he's playing. More reason is there too than even great love, for all the island looks to the dwellers here for wisdom and leadership, for song and lore. And here, in a great corin of elms, dwells Merrill e Turink. It is interesting that already as Tolkien is writing these early versions of his stories, he's making word lists and name lists, right? That Christopher found those notebooks too. So we have in the Book of Lost Tales, you know, yet more of these. Like I say, I look that up. Merrill e Turinke, which I don't know what is. Merrill is not in QL. What is that? The elf language has changed too over time, because we've got here Goldogrin as one of the languages. GL. What's QL at this point? Kenya lexicon, which is the books that, okay, so but this Merrill Turinke is not in the notebook Kenya lexicon, but Turinke, queen, is given with a great many other derivatives of the word root Turo, be strong, including Turambar, Turamarto, and Tur king. In Goldolgrin, or Gnomish lexicon, our Tur can have power to Tur king, Turwin queen, Turum authority, rule, strength, Turinthi princess, especially titled Gwithil. There are also these later additions in the lexicon, the Gnomish lexicon. Gwithil e Durinthi equals Merrill e Turinki, queen of flowers. Gwethra, bloom, flourish, and the stem Gweth is here compared to Kenya Mer, which is not in the notebook, the Kenya lexicon. Okay, see, it's like Tolkien is doing it already, and he's already very early in these drafts. You've got the stories and the place names and the character names and the desire to create the stories that go with the language. He's making notes of all that, but he's also casting that spell for you, which is you think you've traveled to the ends of the earth, but you find out you're actually at the center. But you're still mystified, right? That there's that glimpse in the afar of the city that you don't know, and it's from afar, and then you find out you're actually in it. The Coterian, right? That's glimpses of the sunlit towers. You're amongst them, and by way of the travel that you've done over the last day, now you find yourself at the center of the story, and this Queen of Flowers is where you are. Comment, now a corn is a great circular hedge, be it of stone or thorn or even trees, that encloses a green sward. We're in a fairy circle, somehow, of trees, right? Merrill comes of the blood of Inwe, whom the gnomes call Inwithiel, he that was king of all the Eldar when they dealt in Kor. That was in the days before hearing the lament of the world, Inwe led them forth to the land of men. But those great and sad things, and how the Eldar came to this fair and lonely island, maybe I will tell them another time. It's like one of these explanations that's not an explanation, very much like Tom Bombadil gives our hobbits, when you're suddenly thrust into the middle of the story and, as it were, beguiled, enchanted with all of the names of the elder days. To remind you, we looked at this when I was reading poetry, right? That's also what, for example, Gimli does when he's singing about he's singing about the ancient stories, right? When Durin was alive. The world was fair, the mountains tall, in elder days, before the fall of mighty kings in Nargothrond and Gondolin, who now beyond the western seas have passed away. The world was fair in Durin's day. It works in The Lord of the Rings that there are these gestures towards all of these other stories, these distant realms. But in the Book of Lost Tales, in this setup in the College of Lost Play, you're Tolkien's trying to do it at the same time, right? We're now in the story, in this story world, finding ourselves in the center of the story, in the Citadel, and yet still getting that glimpse of distance and untold tales and names of stories, names that are for which no explanations are ever forthcoming, or their promises of stories that are going to be forthcoming. What do we do about that? Um, and that is, well, I'm guessing, right now I'm wondering whether it works at all, and what you think about whether it's working. uh it's certainly, when the first time I was reading the history of Middle Earth and trying to make sense of all of these stories, I didn't like it. I wanted to be enchanted by the knowledge of all of this backstory, but the problem is it's backstory for characters that aren't really the characters that you want to know the backstory of, because in the revisions all of these characters change. Like Ariel in this story is somehow a son of Arendelle. Well, we know, the son of Arendelle are Elrond and Elros, so who's Ariel? We're not even, he's a traveler, he's a man here. But Tolkien's revisions go through so many modifications and layers. Like, for example, in the Book of Lost Tales, the Silmarils are just jewels. They're not the feature that drives, the journeys of the elves, and they're being cursed by Fëanor's desire to gain. None of that plays out in these early versions of the stories, much like with the ring in The Hobbit being transformed into the ring in The Lord of the Rings. That the early versions of The Hobbit, it's just a magic ring that Tolkien gets with the riddle game, and it turns him invisible, and it's not the great driver of, the control of other wills. It's like the stories that Tolkien wanted to tell were always far glimpsed in his own imagination of telling them, and he's sort of distressed constantly by that. I mean, the more you tell the story and the more you pin it down, the more you yourself want yet more stories out there in the distance. Right? He said that in his letter to Worsket, right? To go there is to destroy the magic unless new unattainable vistas are again revealed. That you're going to always want to find that next island. You're always going to want to find that next Alp, right? And the next mountain to climb, the next vista to achieve, and that therefore the magic only works if you persistently feel like there's a story that's not yet told. Tolkien also wrote another poem where this is another of the sort of supplementary ones. August 1915 in Oxford, so when he's an undergraduate, when he's setting up this Cottage of Lost play, and he calls it You and Me and the Cottage of Lost play. How do we get there? How do we find ourselves in the Cottage of Lost play? You and me, we know that land, and often have been there, in the long old days, old nursery days, a dark child and a fair. Was it down the paths of firelit dreams in winter cold and white, or in the blue-spun twilight hours of little early tucked-up beds in drowsy summer night, that you and I got lost in sleep and met each other there, your dark hair on your white nightgown, and mine was tangled fair? We wandered shyly hand in hand, or rollicked in the fairy sand, and gathered pearls and shells and pails, while all about the nightingales were singing in the trees. We dug for silver with our spades by little inland sparkling seas, then ran ashore through sleepy glades and down a warm and winding lane we never found again between high whispering trees. The air was neither night or day, but faintly dark with softest light, when first there glimmering into sight the Cottage of Lost play. 'Twas budded very, very old, white and thatched with straws of gold, and pierced with peeping lattices that looked towards the sea. And our own children's garden plots were there, our own forget-me-nots, red daisies, cress, and mustard, and blue nemophili. Oh, all the borders trimmed with box were full of favorite flowers, of flocks of larkspur, pinks, and hollyhocks, beneath a red may-tree. And all the paths were full of shapes of tumbling, happy, white-clad shapes, and with them you and me. And some had silver watering cans and watered all their gowns, or sprayed each other. Some laid plans to build them houses, fairy towns, or dwellings in the trees. And some were clambering on the roof, some crooning lonely and aloof, and some were dancing fairy rings and weaving pearly daisy strings, or chasing golden bees. But here and there a little pair, with rosy cheeks and tangled hair, debated quaint old childish things. And we were one of these. And why it was tomorrow came, and with his grey hand led us back, and why we never found the same old cottage or the magic track that leads between a silver sea and those old shores and gardens fair, where all things are that ever were, we know not, you and me. I think it's worth wrestling with Tolkien's own exercise here. It's like he's sort of throwing out possibilities on how to set up this world that he wants to tell the stories in, and it's very interesting. His earliest efforts are the verses from 1915 or thereabouts, and then he starts trying to write it into prose. That he has one that, I mean, what he wanted to accomplish clearly from the beginning was that feeling of being around a fire and hearing stories, and that it's a bit sort of twee and cozy because you're well, when do you first remember hearing stories? What I think he's got all the elements right, and he's grasping at the sort of experience that we tend to want to relive with the stories that we first heard, right? I'm thinking of campfire stories, why stories around a fire. One, that's what I think he's definitely wrestling with. That you do it somehow. Maybe it's all campfire stories, right? He's out in the woods. He's got trees. He's got flowers. That you are there exploring in the wilderness. It's not really wilderness. They're really gardens, right? It's like the cottage has a garden. We have drawings of his from this period too, that he's drawing the houses. There is a very, very sort of childlike longing for that kind of storytelling that you get. And the recognition that you want somehow to find yourself not just listening to the story, but in the story. And you realize we're always doing that. It's very interesting that this first poem that he writes is you and me in the Cottage of Lost Play. We want somehow to not just be hearing the story that these characters are participating in, but somehow know what kind of connection we have to that story, which is, of course, why the Silmarillion, as it was originally published, was so frustrating to people, that it just sort of started out of nowhere. And in fact, what it's missing, which these earlier versions have, however sort of awkward and clumsily they do it, is they actually have the storyteller. They have the frame narrative of how do you come to be in the context that the stories are being told. That you want to know where this room of logs is. You want to know I mean, the fire is the fire is that center of the storytelling, and the people ranged around the fire are the place where the storytelling happens. And you need some journey to get to that place where you're sitting around the fire. But once you're sitting around the fire, you find yourself also participating in the stories. If you're familiar with, sorry, it's very dry today. If you're familiar with Beowulf, you'll recognize this trope, right? Again, it's the Beowulf itself starts with the stories told around the fire in the mead hall. I'm sort of wrestling with this and thinking about it. I knew for this episode I wanted to talk about this problem of framing, right? And this problem of setup, and how Tolkien is making this traveler tale be in fact the frame for how we get into his legendarium and his mythology. But then realizing that it's not just the traveler tale, it's the tale told around the fire that he wants you to get inside of, and that somehow therefore that fire storytelling is the place where it's going to happen. And that stories that don't have that give you no anchor, right? They give you no sense of where the stories are coming from. I think there's something more going on here than simply trying to give you a set of stories. And I read the titles of the ones that are in the Book of Lost Tales out for you, but it's more than just giving you a set of stories that are collected and framed by a frame narrative, right? It's famous medieval collections like Boccaccio's Decameron or the Canterbury Tales, that you need some reason for everybody to be together telling stories. In the Decameron, it's because they've all run away from Florence because of the plague, and the idea is there are 10 of them are going to tell 10 a story each day for 10 days, so you end up with 100 stories. With Chaucer, which was never finished, you're going to have the pilgrims on the pilgrimage to Canterbury, thus the Canterbury Tales, telling each other stories while they're on a journey. With Tolkien, he wants these stories to be the stories that you learn while sitting around the fire, right? So he wants them to have, I think, this, I mean, certainly, and always we're sort of getting there, certainly this deep mythological significance, but I'm hypothesizing that the need for it being sitting around the fire is what's giving it this certain kind of character. Now, another sort of model, there's sort of generic models genre models in Decameron and Canterbury Tales, is collection of stories you're going to tell, but those are all sort of episodic, right? That they are adventure stories, trickster stories. They don't have, quite frankly, the same scriptural element as Tolkien's story does. That's where one of the reviewers of the Book of Lost Tales is absolutely right, that there's constantly in here, although it's pagan, sorry, I know that was right, although it's pagan, something of a sense of quasi-biblical archaic, and it's not just the language, the archaizing of the language. It's that archaizing of what should the collection of stories actually include. And one great Tolkien scholar, Marjorie Burns, has suggested that, well, the deep model for what's going on in this Book of Lost Tales is the prose edda of Snorri Sturluson, and the Ariel character is rather like this King Gylfi of Sweden, who in his journey goes and finds himself in a storytelling contest and asks various questions about the gods and their homes, their halls, about creation, about the structure of heaven and earth, and about the last days, the Ragnarok. And that the Book of Lost Tales, what Ariel ends up asking about not just like where he lives, right? That we have that when Lindo is explained to him, you're on the island that's at the center of the world, and in the city that's the center of the citadel of the island, and so forth. But in the long run, we're going to end up with the stories that Lindo and Vare, who are telling the children, and children need to be told these stories because they need to know where they are, right, in the stories, that they have builded of good magic this cottage of lost play, and here old tales, old song, and elfin music are treasured and rehearsed. Ever and anon our children fare forth again to find the great lands, and to go about among the lonely children and whisper to them at dusk and early bed by night light and candle flame, or comfort those that weep. I told listen to the complaints of those that are punished or chidden, and hear their tales and fain to take their part. And this to me seems a quaint and merry service, but this old tales, old songs, and elven music are treasured and rehearsed in this cottage lost play, that there is a grander structure than simply we want a lot of adventure stories somehow collected together, and that it seems therefore to have this biblical character, but well, then why shouldn't the Silmarillion be somewhat easier to read? Well, I put it to you that, again, I get to keep doing this because I'm really convinced that this was always the book that Tolkien is in fact trying to write for us, that he is trying to give us a sense of not just what it's like hearing any stories, hearing fantastic stories, hearing the stories that you grow up and sort of want adventures in, but he's trying to give you the sense of what it's like finding yourself in this story over and over and over again. And this is why I say Owen and I just seem to keep intersecting right now, because he's been talking about this. We're in God's story. There's only one story. How you see yourself in the story is dependent on whether or not you recognize that you're in God's story. If you don't recognize in your God's story, it's hellish. And Melko or Morgoth is going to have that difficulty. But if you see yourself in God's story, it's suddenly great. It's a fairy story. It's full of grace. It's full of not just joy, not just happiness. It's full of wonder and awe, and the kind of descriptions that you get when you say, spring still hath joy, thy spring is ever fair among the trees, but drowsy summer by thy streams already stoops to hear the secret player pipe out beyond the tangle of her forest streams, the long thin tune that still do sing, the elvish harebells nodding an adjacent ring upon the castle walls, already stoops to listen to the clear cold spell come up her sunny aisles and perfumed halls, a sad and haunting magic note, a strand of silver glass remote. That's again the Coterian, the city, the Coterian verse. That okay, I'm convinced, and I'm convinced as a Christian that this actually matters. That there is only one story that we are trying to find ourselves in, and always the problem for us as I guess storytellers, but also as the children who are listening to the story, is how do we awaken that sense of being in the story, that you've gathered round, you've got these tapestries of all the stories that you might belong to, but you've gathered in the tale, the hall of logs, the room of logs, and there's this magic fire, right? I think this is the magic fire greatly aids the teller in his tale. Well, I'm in fact thinking I prayed before I began this episode because I wasn't sure how I was going to get here, but I prayed for the Spirit to give me the voice to be able to take you to the place that I needed to in this. And I realized my Dorothy moments are constant right now. It's like you're constantly finding that you're wearing the ruby slippers that you didn't know you had. The magic fire that great leads the teller in his tale. You're praying for this, the Holy Spirit, right? You're praying for that flame of knowledge and understanding and focus that you get from sitting around the flame of the truth, the flame of the story. Why is the Bible so hard to read? I do get this question, and I've gotten it in emails and other contexts recently, where people say, I want to know more about Christianity. Where should I start? And you want to tell them, go start with the Bible, right? But it's this, and you'll have people like Owen telling you, we're in the story. This is the story. You're in the story. All you need to do is recognize yourself in God's story. And yet the book is so hard to know how to, where do you start? At the same time, Joshua called the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh and said to them, you have all done that, Moses. You have done all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you. You've all also obeyed me in all things. Neither have you left your brethren this long time until this present day, keeping the commandment of your God. Therefore, as the Lord your God hath given you your brethren rest and peace, and he promised, return and go to your dwellings into the land of your possession, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan. Whose story is this? How do you find yourself? How do you know whether you are Ariel, the son of Arendelle, hearing stories with Lindo? How do you recognize yourself in the story? Well, this is what Tolkien was wrestling with throughout, and you recognize that the reason the Lord of the Rings works, and as he recognized when he was writing to his readers later, is that there were glimpses of this larger story always there in the background. And it's like the Lord of the Rings is the easy one to read because it's the one that sort of most connects us with our regular experience, our present experience. But there's always that hint that there was another book, right? There were other books, and we know from the note on the Shire records is that there were several of them, right? That there were the Red Book of West March, that was Bilbo's diary, and that Frodo then wrote in. Frodo brought it back to the Shire together with many loose leaves of notes, and during Shire Reckoning 1421, second SR. I don't know my own dates. It's ridiculous. Tale of Years. Where are we in the calendars? Well, anyway, SR 1421. He nearly filled its pages with his account of the war. But annexed to it and preserved with it, probably in a single red case, were the 3 large volumes bound in red leather that Bilbo gave to him as a parting gift. To these 4 volumes that were added in West March, a 5th containing commentaries, genealogies. What was in those 3 large volumes bound in red leather? Well, we know from other context and other sources that it's this, right? It's the stories. Bilbo becomes the storyteller sitting around the fire. Ariel, the one who travels to Rivendell, in effect, and collects the stories there from both oral and written sources, living and written sources, and compiles them, and they turn into the stories that the hobbits know. But there's the reason the Lord of the Rings works is ultimately Tolkien did figure out how to give you the sense of finding yourself in that story through a storyteller. But to do that, he had to invent the hobbits, who are the ones that live in those little underground cottages that are bigger on the inside than they seem on the outside, and that introduce you to the stories that he had constantly been trying to figure out how to tell by way of his earlier methodologies. So, if you find it hard to read The Cottage of Lost Play or The Silmarillion, it's because there aren't hobbits. And that leaves us the question of why hobbits are absolutely necessary to the storytelling. To be continued.